The mess hall at Kestrel Bay Naval Medical Center went dead quiet on a Tuesday morning when Lieutenant Derek Masso pointed at the cafeteria worker's forearm and laughed. "What are those supposed to be?" he said, loud enough for 24 sailors to hear. "You get those at a county fair?" The woman behind the steam trays didn't look up. She kept ladling scrambled eggs, her jaw tight, her eyes flat. The tattoos ran from her left wrist to the inside of her elbow. Numbers, coordinates, a string of symbols that meant nothing to anyone in that room. Almost nothing. Because those marks weren't decoration. They were the only evidence left of a classified operation the United States military had spent 6 years pretending never happened, and the woman wearing them had been erased right along with it. If this story already has you hooked, subscribe, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go. The eggs were always overcooked by 7:15. Maya Reyes had learned that in her first week. The kitchen staff at Kestrel Bay Naval Medical Center started the steam trays too early, and by the time the breakfast rush hit, everything on the line had gone rubbery and pale. She'd mentioned it once to the kitchen supervisor, a heavy-set man named Garfield, who managed the cafeteria with the exhausted tolerance of someone who had stopped expecting improvement years ago. He'd nodded, said he'd look into it, and nothing had changed. So she stopped mentioning it. She showed up at 5:45 every morning, tied on her apron, pinned her hair back, and stood behind the counter for 7 hours. She ladled eggs, portioned out fruit cups, restocked the juice station when it ran low, and said, "Have a good one," to people who didn't respond. She had been doing this for 18 months. She was 31 years old, and she was very good at being invisible. Kestrel Bay was a working naval medical center on the Northern California coast, not as large as some of the major installations, but busy in the particular way that military hospitals always were, with a population that turned over fast and kept its emotional distance. The staff were professional. The patients were young. The officers who passed through the cafeteria were mostly focused on their phones or their conversations, and they ordered food the way people ordered food at airports, functionally, impatiently, without looking at the person handing it to them. That suited Maya fine. She had a studio apartment 12 minutes from the base, a used truck she kept in decent shape, and a library card she used more than anyone she knew. She went to bed early, ran 5 miles before her shift, and did not socialize. Her coworkers thought she was shy. Her supervisor thought she was reliable. Neither description was exactly wrong, but neither came close to accurate. What Maya Reyes actually was, what she had been before Kestrel Bay, before the apron and the steam trays and the 7:15 eggs, was something the United States military had officially decided did not exist. There were no records, no personnel files, no commendations, no discharge papers, no documented service history of any kind. As far as any searchable government database was concerned, Maya Reyes had never worn a uniform. The tattoos were the only thing she hadn't been able to erase. She'd thought about it in the months after everything fell apart. Laser removal, cover-up work. But there was something in her that refused. They were coordinates, specific, actual coordinates, from 3 separate operations conducted in locations that could not be named in any public document. The string of symbols beneath them was a unit designation that had been officially decommissioned and its record sealed in a classified annex that very few people at the Pentagon even knew existed. If she removed those marks, she was agreeing with what the military had decided, that it hadn't happened, that they hadn't been there, that the 6 people who didn't come home from the last mission weren't worth remembering. She wasn't willing to agree to that. So she wore long sleeves in winter and said nothing when people asked about them in summer. And she stood behind the counter at Kestrel Bay and let the world ignore her. It worked, mostly. Until the Tuesday morning Derek Masso decided to be funny. He came in at 7:05 with 3 other junior officers, all of them loud in the way of people who'd been up late and were running on coffee and mutual attention. Masso was young, mid-20s, broad through the shoulders, wearing his rank with the particular confidence of someone who'd earned it recently and hadn't yet learned that earning and deserving were different things. He was a lieutenant, which meant he outranked approximately half the room and was very aware of it. Maya had seen his type before. She served him eggs and said nothing. The comment came when he reached across the counter for a juice carton and his eyes landed on her left forearm. What are those supposed to be? The question was aimed at his companions as much as at her. A performance, not a genuine inquiry. He pointed at the tattoos, grinning. You get those at a county fair or what? The guys with him laughed. One of them looked briefly uncomfortable and then laughed anyway. Maya kept her eyes on the tray she was restocking. Eggs or fruit cup, she said. I'm serious. What is that? Maso leaned a little on the counter, pushing it. Looks like coordinates. You been on a battlefield? More laughter. I didn't know the cafeteria was a combat zone. Someone at a nearby table was watching. A few people at the coffee station glanced over. The room didn't quite go silent, but it tilted. The particular shift in atmosphere when a public humiliation is in progress and people are deciding whether to look or look away. Eggs, Maya said, are on the left, fruit cups are at the end. Have a good morning. Her voice was level. Her hands were steady. She turned back to the line, and after a moment, Maso picked up his tray and moved on, still talking to his friends about something else. The shift continued. She restocked the juice. She wiped down the counter. She watched the room empty and fill and empty again with the tide of meal rotations. And she thought about nothing in particular, and she went home at 2:15 and made coffee and sat in her small apartment looking at the water until the light changed. That night she didn't sleep well. She hadn't slept well in a long time. That was also not something she mentioned to anyone. Wednesday started gray and cold, the kind of November morning where the fog off the bay hadn't fully lifted by the time the breakfast rush began. Maya was at the counter by 6, earlier than usual because 2 of the kitchen staff had called out sick and Garfield had texted her at 5 asking if she could come in. She said yes. She always said yes. By 7:30, the mess hall was at capacity. Medical staff pulling early shifts, sailors rotating through, a group of visiting trainees who hadn't yet figured out the layout and kept blocking the flow near the drink station. It was noisy in the functional way of a working cafeteria, silverware on trays, conversation at a dozen tables, the low thud of the kitchen exhaust fan running overhead. Maya was at the far end of the counter handling a backed-up section when she heard the impact. It wasn't a crash exactly, more like a sudden wrong sound, the kind that registers in the body before the brain processes it. A heavy, wet thud from the corridor just outside the mess hall's east entrance, followed by a voice saying, "Oh God," and then shouting. She was moving before she'd consciously decided to. The hallway outside the east entrance ran alongside a utility section, storage rooms, a loading bay access, a stairwell that the staff used as a shortcut. A young sailor was on the floor, his back against the wall, one hand pressed to his throat and the other scrabbling at the linoleum. His face was already going the wrong color. A small metal cart had tipped over near him. He'd apparently caught the edge of it coming down the stairs too fast, and the impact had done something to his airway. 3 people were standing over him doing nothing, not from cruelty, from the paralysis that hits non-medical civilians in genuine emergencies when the gap between knowing you should help and knowing how to help is too wide to cross in the seconds available. Maya dropped to her knees beside him. Her hands found his throat, assessed, moved. The angle of his head was wrong. She adjusted it, 2-fingered, precise. The kind of movement that doesn't look like much from the outside but has maybe a 15-second margin before the situation becomes unrecoverable. She checked his airway. She talked to him, low and direct. "I've got you. Stay with me. Don't try to move your head." Her other hand was already at his wrist, counting pulse. "Someone call the medical team," she said, and the tone of her voice was different from the voice she used behind the counter. Not louder, but with a quality of quiet command that made the nearest bystander pull out his phone immediately. She worked for 4 minutes before the emergency responders arrived. When they did, she gave them a clean verbal handover. Airway status, pulse, what she'd done and in what order. And then she stood back and let them take over, and she was already pulling off her gloves when the team leader looked at her and said, "You a nurse?" "No," she said. He looked at her for a second. "You've done that before." She picked up the gloves she'd grabbed from the cart in the hallway. She'd taken them automatically, without thinking about it, the way you don't think about breathing, and she folded them and walked back toward the cafeteria. She was halfway through the east doors when she became aware that she was being watched. Not by one person, by a room. The mess hall had a clear line of sight to the corridor through the east entrance, and the glass panels on either side of the door meant that most of what had just happened was visible to anyone sitting at the right angle, which, apparently, was a significant portion of the people currently eating breakfast. Lieutenant Masso was at a table 6 feet from the door. He was staring at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not the easy confidence of yesterday morning, but something more uncertain, recalibrating. She walked back to the counter. She washed her hands. She went back to serving eggs. It was 20 minutes later that the second thing happened. She was restocking the fruit at the far end of the line when she felt it. The particular quality of attention that happens when someone enters a room and changes the atmosphere. She'd learned to register it years ago, in places where noticing that kind of shift was the difference between being ready and being caught unprepared. She looked up. The man who had just walked into the mess hall was somewhere in his late 60s, broad-framed and moving with the deliberate ease of someone who had spent decades in physical environments. He wasn't in uniform, civilian clothes, a dark jacket, but there was nothing civilian about the way he held himself or the way his eyes moved across the room before settling. They settled on her. She set down the fruit tray. He walked toward the counter with the direct trajectory of someone who had decided something before he entered, and he stopped on the other side of the sneeze guard and looked at her forearm. He looked at the tattoos for 3 seconds. The coordinates, the unit designation, the numbers that meant nothing to the people who'd mocked them. And then he looked at her face. His name was General Harlan Ostro, retired. She hadn't seen him in 6 years. The last time she'd been in the same room as him was a debrief in a basement in Virginia, 4 days after she'd walked out of a mountain range in hostile territory alone. And he'd sat across from her and told her that the operation had never happened, that her team had never existed, and that he was sorry for the choices that had been made above both their heads. He hadn't expected to be sorry. She'd seen it in him, the genuine weight of it, which was the only reason she hadn't hated him with the same fullness she reserved for the people who'd actually made the call. "Phantom 7, he said quietly. The words were barely above a murmur, but the man closest to the counter caught the sound and looked up, and there was something about the particular gravity of Ostro's voice that made 2 other heads turn. Maya looked at him steadily. "Can I help you, sir? You're alive." There was something in his face that wasn't performance. "I didn't know. I looked after... I want you to know that. I looked." "Scrambled or fried?" she said. His jaw worked. Maya. He hadn't said her name out loud, not her real first name anyway, the name that appeared on no military document in 6 years, and the sound of it landed in a way she wasn't entirely prepared for. She held her face still. The mess hall had gotten quiet, not the mild quieting of a room registering a disturbance, the complete dropped-pin silence of people recognizing that something outside the ordinary is occurring and choosing stillness in response. Ostro kept his voice low. "I need to speak with you. Not here. Not like this. I'm on shift until 2. I'll wait." She looked at him for a long moment. The calculation she ran was fast and familiar. How much did he know about why she was here, what he was likely to want, whether whatever had brought him to Kestrel Bay specifically was going to be manageable or the kind of thing that turned unmanageable quickly? "Cafeteria closes at noon on Wednesdays," she said. "We can use the staff room." "Garfield," she raised her voice to normal volume, addressing her supervisor 3 stations down. "I'm taking my 15 in about 10 minutes, okay?" Garfield, who had not entirely been paying attention, looked over and nodded. Ostro nodded too. He took a table in the corner and he sat with his back to the wall, which was the only way she'd expected him to sit, and he waited. At the table closest to him, Derek Masso had not moved. He was watching the retired general with an expression that was slowly reshaping itself into something that Maya, if she'd been in the business of reading people's emotional states carefully, which she always was, regardless of whether it appeared so, recognized as the beginning of a very uncomfortable realization. The staff room was a small rectangle behind the kitchen, a folding table, mismatched chairs, a microwave that smelled faintly of something that had been heated too long. Ostro sat across from her with his hands flat on the table. She sat with her coffee and said nothing and let him start. 2 weeks ago, he said, an intelligence asset was killed in Hamburg. Embedded cover, civilian credentials, 6 years in place. He paused. She was compromised through a leaked document, operational profile, extraction routes, handler contacts, cover identity. The document was sourced from a classified database that maintains personnel records for units with covert designations. Maya looked at her coffee. The database, Ostro continued, cross-references with historical mission records, including records that were sealed. He let that sit for a second. Including the records from Operation Coldfall. She heard that name and kept her face the same. If those records are being accessed, she said, then whoever's pulling them has clearance above GS-15 or they crack the encryption. Either way, that's not something I can help with. I don't work there anymore. You know what's in those records? Ostro. She said his name flat. I know what's in those records because I lived them. That's different from being useful to you. You know them in a way no one else does. You know the gaps. What was altered, what was omitted. He leaned forward slightly. The people doing the accessing, they know about Phantom 7. They know the unit existed. What they're looking for is the operational data that was removed from the official records. And the only person who knows exactly what that data was is the person who was there when they removed it. She picked up her coffee. I know what you're telling me. I'm just not sure why you're telling me here, in person, when you could have made a phone call. You don't have a phone, he said, not one that we can reach. That was true. The phone she carried was a prepaid that she changed out every 3 months. The number was known to exactly no one she'd previously known in any professional capacity. I also came in person, Ostro said carefully, because there's a secondary issue. The last analyst who was assigned to the Coldfall file review was flagged internally last week for suspicious contact. He was found dead yesterday morning, in his car, in a parking structure in San Jose. He waited. He had your original service photograph in his jacket pocket. Maya set down the coffee. The room was quiet enough that she could hear the kitchen ventilation running on the other side of the wall, and the distant sound of the mess hall starting to thin out as the lunch rotation ended, and underneath that the kind of silence that happens when information lands and everything else temporarily stops mattering. Who knew he had the photograph? She said. We don't know yet. Who knew I was here? No one, as far as we can determine. But he had my photograph in a parking structure in San Jose. She set it back not because she hadn't heard it, but because she was sorting through the implications while she spoke, laying them out, checking the edges. Which means someone went looking for me specifically, found an asset who was close to the file, turned him or threatened him, and got information out of him, whether or not he actually had my current location. That's the working theory. What's the practical timeline? We don't know. The photograph was 6 years old. Your current appearance, Ostro paused with the diplomatic discomfort of a man choosing words carefully, is somewhat different. She'd cut her hair short 3 years ago. She'd put on maybe 12 pounds of muscle since the operational photograph was taken. The woman in that picture looked like a person Maya remembered being and no longer entirely was, but photographs could be enhanced, cross-referenced, aged. It wasn't a wall, it was a delay. You came to warn me, she said. I came to warn you and to ask you. I know what you're going to ask. She stood up, picked up her coffee, and walked the 2 steps to the counter where the sugar packets were kept. She didn't need sugar, she just needed to stand for a moment. You want me to look at the Coldfall records and identify what was taken, map the gaps, give you something to work with? Yes. And in return? Ostro was quiet for a moment. In return, we protect you. She almost laughed, not with humor, with the specific quality of bitter recognition that comes from hearing an offer you've heard before from the same category of person. The last time the military offered to protect me, she said, I ended up buried in a personnel file that didn't exist and serving eggs in California. I know. His voice was rough. I know that, Maya. I'm not going to pretend the institution behaved well. It didn't. I'm telling you that the people who made those calls are not the people asking you now, and that what's happening with the Coldfall data is bigger than you or me or what happened 6 years ago, and that people are dying because of it. She turned and looked at him. "The sailor this morning," he said. "In the corridor. You went straight to him." "That's different." "Is it?" She didn't answer that. She stood there with her coffee and looked at the retired general who had once told her to her face that she was being erased, and who had sat with the weight of it visibly on him. And she thought about the analyst in the parking structure in San Jose, and about the woman in Hamburg who'd been killed because someone cracked open a file that was supposed to stay sealed. "I need 24 hours, she said. "You don't have 24 hours. If whoever pulled that photograph is working from anything else they got from the analyst, they may already have a direction." "Then I need tonight." He looked at her steadily. "I have 2 people outside. They'll stay through the night. I need your current address." "No." The answer was immediate and final. "I'll come to you." "Where are you staying?" He named a hotel in Kestrel Bay, 3 miles from the base. She nodded. He stood, and she noticed for the first time that he moved more carefully than he used to. His right knee was stiff, probably a replacement, and he was older, genuinely older, in a way that the 6 intervening years had compressed into something visible all at once now that she was looking directly at him. "The tattoos," he said, pausing at the door. She looked at her forearm. "I'm glad you kept them," he said. Then he left. She stood in the staff room for a while after that, finishing her coffee, thinking about Hamburg and San Jose and the specific way her own photograph might have been transported from a sealed database to a dead man's jacket pocket. She was thinking tactically, methodically, which was the mode she defaulted to when things started to move because it was the mode that kept her functional when emotion threatened to make everything complicated. But underneath that, in the part of her that she kept very quiet and very still, she was thinking about 6 names. The names of the people who had gone into a mountain range in hostile territory on a mission that officially never happened and who had not come out again. She was the only one who still said those names out loud. She said them every morning, running, before the sun came fully up. When she pushed back through the kitchen door into the mess hall, the lunch crowd was mostly gone. The remaining staff were wiping down tables. The juice station needed restocking. Lieutenant Masso was still there. He was sitting alone at a table near the east entrance, which was unusual. The junior officers generally cleared out fast, duty schedules keeping them moving. He had an untouched cup of coffee in front of him and the specific look of someone who is working through a rearrangement of their previous understanding of a situation. He looked up when she walked out. She kept moving. She picked up the juice station restocking tray and started on the left side, methodical, the same as always. "Hey!" His voice came from about 6 feet back, and it lacked the easy performance of yesterday morning. She didn't stop moving. "Hey, can I?" He stopped. She heard him stand. "I'm sorry." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Yesterday," he said. "The thing I said about the tattoos, I was being an idiot." He said it without decoration, which she noted. "And then this morning, in the corridor, I saw what you did. With Petty Officer Kamens." He paused. "They said he's going to be okay." "Good," she said. Masso was quiet for a moment. He was trying to figure out what to say next, she could tell. Trying to ask the question without quite asking it. "Those tattoos," he finally said. "The coordinates." She picked up the next juice carton and slotted it in. "Those are real places," he said. It wasn't exactly a question. She didn't answer him. She finished restocking the station, set the tray down, and turned to face him. His expression was different now from anything she'd seen on him in the 2 weeks he'd been rotating through the medical center's staff wing. The performance was gone. What was underneath it was young, genuinely young, in the way that becomes visible when the posture drops. "You worked with General Ostro," he said. Not accusing, figuring out. "Juice station stocked," she said. "Good afternoon, Lieutenant." She turned and walked back toward the kitchen, and she did not look back, and she kept her walk even and unhurried in the way she'd learned to do in environments where the appearance of calm was its own form of armor. But her mind was already in motion, running through the cold fall records the way she'd memorized them, identifying the gaps, calculating what someone with access to a sealed military database might be looking for and what they might already have found. Running through the names of people who would know those records existed. Running through the specific and narrowing list of people who would know to look for her. Behind her, she heard Maso sit back down, and then the quiet sound of a room returning to its ordinary noise, and then nothing but the kitchen ventilation and her own footsteps on the linoleum. In her jacket pocket, her prepaid phone sat silent. For now. She had tonight to decide what she was going to do, and the weight of it settled on her shoulders as she pushed through the kitchen doors. Not heavy exactly. She'd carried heavier, but particular. The weight of a thing that had been waiting, patient and inevitable, and had finally arrived. Outside, through the kitchen's narrow service window, the bay was slate gray under November clouds, and the fog was coming back in. She had tonight to decide, and she used every minute of it. The drive home took 12 minutes, and she spent them running through the same calculus she'd been doing since Ostro sat down across from her in the staff room. Not panicking, not spiraling, just working the problem the way she'd been trained to work problems, from the outside in, identifying the edges before trying to find the center. The fog had settled fully over the bay by the time she turned into her apartment complex, and the streetlights made the mist look amber and close, and she sat in her truck for 2 minutes after she parked, watching the mirrors before she went inside. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it. That was the first thing she checked. Not consciously, not with any visible performance of caution, but in the practiced way of someone who'd spent years in environments where exactly as I left it was not something you assumed. It was something you verified. The books on the table were angled correctly. The kitchen window latch was in the position she'd set it. Nothing had been touched. She made coffee she didn't particularly want and sat at the small table near the window and looked at the water and thought about the Coldfall records. Operation Coldfall had been a 7-person mission, 2 years in the planning, conducted in a mountainous region that the military's official map classifications listed as a zone of no current operational interest. That designation was itself a cover, the kind of bureaucratic language that meant the opposite of what it said. The mission's objectives had been narrow and specific. Locate and extract a foreign asset who'd been transmitting intelligence for 3 years and whose cover had been flagged as potentially compromised. Get the asset out. Destroy the equipment left behind. Come home. Simple, in theory. The kind of mission that looked clean on paper and almost never was in practice. What had not been on paper, what had never been on any document, sealed or otherwise, was the intelligence they found on site, not the asset's materials. Something else. Files the asset had been holding as leverage, files that detailed a domestic compromise at a level that, if it had become public, would have destabilized multiple command structures and ended several careers that were still, as far as Maya knew, very much ongoing. The asset had died before extraction. That was official, more or less. It appeared in the sealed record as subject deceased prior to completion of objective. What was not in the record was how. What was not in the record was what the team had found in those files, what they documented before the site destruction, or the fact that 2 of Maya's teammates had pulled physical copies before the equipment went down. Those copies had not made it out. Neither had the 2 teammates who'd carried them. What Maya carried was in her head. Dates, names, transaction records, communications threads. She'd read through the materials for 3 hours while the team held the perimeter, and she had the kind of memory that made that 3 hours sufficient. She hadn't written it down. She hadn't transmitted it. She'd memorized it and kept it, in the same place she kept the 6 names she said every morning, because she'd known even then, young and still operational and not yet fully understanding what was about to happen to her, that the information was a different kind of weapon, and that weapons needed to be held carefully until the right moment to use them. 6 years later, sitting in her apartment with the bay fog pressing against the window, she thought about who might know that she'd been the one to read those files, who might know what she'd retained. The answer, when she was honest about it, was uncomfortable. Not many people, but not nobody. She left the apartment at 8:45. Not to go to Ostro's hotel, not yet. She walked 3 blocks east, found a payphone that she'd noted the location of when she first moved to the area, because old habits were not habits so much as they were structural features of how she functioned, and she made a call to a number she'd memorized and never written down. It rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered with a single syllable. "It's me," Maya said. "I need a file check, not through channels, Coldfall adjacent. An analyst named, do you have access to the San Jose incident from yesterday morning?" A pause. Then, That's a closed investigation. I know it's closed. I need to know if the photograph found on the deceased was the only item connecting to the secondary personnel designations. Another pause, longer. Where are you? Not important. Can you run it? I can run it tomorrow morning. Early. Run it tonight if you can. Maya looked down the empty street. And if you find anything that moves, anything that looks like active location work, you call me back on this line in the next 6 hours. After that, I'll be somewhere else. She gave the woman the payphone's number and hung up and stood in the cold for a moment with the fog sitting on the back of her neck, and then she walked back to her apartment and packed a bag with the same efficiency she'd always packed bags, fast, functional, nothing she'd miss, and put it by the door and sat down with the coffee she'd abandoned earlier and finally drank it cold. Ostrov's hotel was a mid-tier chain 3 miles from the base, the kind of place that hosted visiting families and contractors and occasional military personnel traveling on personal budgets. He'd taken a corner room on the second floor, which she'd expected. She knocked at 9:10, and he opened the door looking like he'd been sitting up waiting, which he had. There was another person in the room, a woman, late 30s, the particular kind of professional composure that read as either intelligence or legal, and turned out to be both. She introduced herself as Warrant Officer Diana Falk, currently assigned to a joint task force that Maya had not heard of, which either meant it was new or meant it was classified in a way that deliberately kept its name out of circulation. Coldfall came up in an active investigation 8 weeks ago, Falk said, once they'd settled. Ostro on the edge of the bed, Falk in the desk chair, Maya standing because she was not yet comfortable enough to sit. Not as a primary reference, as a cross-reference. Someone queried the sealed annex from an authenticated terminal, pulled the unit designation, and then queried a secondary database for personnel records associated with that designation. Authenticated terminal means cleared access, Maya said. It means compromised cleared access. The terminal belongs to an officer currently stationed in Washington. He was in a different state when the query was made. Maya thought about that. His credentials were used without him. Yes. Which means whoever did this has the technical capacity to spoof a cleared terminal remotely. She looked at Ostro. That's not low level. No, he agreed. It's not. Falk continued. The query returned the unit designation and a partial personnel manifest. 7 names. 3 of those 7 are deceased, confirmed by official records. She paused. The other 4 are listed as whereabouts unknown, discharged under administrative separation. I was one of those 4, Maya said. Yes. And the analyst in San Jose, he was working the Coldfall cross-reference? He was a secondary analyst, not lead. He'd been flagged internally 3 weeks ago for accessing the sealed annex outside his assigned scope. He was supposed to be interviewed last Friday. Falk's voice stayed level. He was found Monday. The gap between flagged and found was not large enough. That was the thing that sat wrong. That was the edge Maya had been pressing on since Ostro mentioned it in the staff room, and it was getting sharper the more she looked at it. Someone had moved fast. Someone who'd known the analyst was about to be interviewed and had chosen to prevent it before he could say what he knew. What did he know? She said. We don't know yet. You're guessing his death prevented you from finding out what he'd found. We're guessing, Falk said, that he had already found something specific and that the photograph in his pocket was information he was holding because he hadn't yet decided what to do with it. Maya looked at the photograph Falk placed on the desk. It was a copy, printed on plain paper, the edges slightly off true. She didn't need to look at it long. She recognized herself at 25, in the same way you recognize a room you lived in years ago. All the features correct, but the proportions somehow wrong in relation to how you experience the space now. He was looking for me specifically, she said. We believe he was looking for anyone who survived Coldfall with operational knowledge intact. You're the most viable candidate. Falk paused. The others from the secondary personnel list, we've been trying to locate them quietly for the past 2 weeks. One is confirmed in Southeast Asia, outside of reach for now. One has been unreachable since last spring. She left that sentence incomplete with a deliberateness that communicated the rest clearly enough. And one checked into a hospital in Phoenix 3 days ago under a civilian name with symptoms consistent with acute poisoning. The room was quiet. Maya sat down. Not from distress. She sat because she was thinking fast and she thought better still. She sat and she went through the math of what she was being told and what it implied about timeline and intent and scale, and the number she kept arriving at was not comforting. This isn't about covering Coldfall anymore, she said. Someone covered Coldfall 6 years ago. This is about something in those records that's currently actionable, something that's worth killing for now. Ostro nodded. He'd been quiet for most of it, present, watching. And when he spoke, it was with the particular weight of someone delivering information they'd been holding back because it required the right moment. Victor Hale, he said. The name landed with the particular weight of a name that is not supposed to exist in the same room as other names being spoken freely. Maya kept her face still. Deputy Undersecretary Hale, Ostro said, is currently under review by 2 separate congressional committees. The reviews are not public. They concern contracts, procurement decisions, and certain communication logs from 6 years ago. He paused. Communication logs from the period directly surrounding Operation Coldfall. She understood then. Completely. The way understanding sometimes arrives not incrementally, but all at once. The files the team found on site, she said. Her voice was low. The ones that were destroyed. Were not fully destroyed, Ostro said. They were. She'd been there. She'd watched. The equipment was destroyed. The copies 2 of your teammates attempted to carry out were lost with them. He held her gaze. But someone else took a set of copies before the destruction. Someone who was not part of your team. The silence in the room had a different texture now. Who? She said. Ostro's jaw moved. That's what we're trying to determine, and that's why whoever is cleaning up the Coldfall connections is moving now. Because Hale's review is moving. Because if the right information surfaces in the right congressional proceeding, everything he's built collapses, she said. Everything, Ostro confirmed. She stood back up. She needed to stand again. She walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot below, at the amber pools of lamplight on wet asphalt, and she thought about Hale, a name she'd known peripherally from the mission briefings, a name that had appeared in the site materials she'd memorized, connected to authorizations and payment transfers that shouldn't have existed and now, apparently, were the specific things someone was willing to kill analysts over. You want me to reconstruct what I read at the site, she said to the window. We need it on record, Falk said, in a form that can be cross-referenced with the communication logs that are already in the committee's possession. If we can corroborate, I'll need immunity, Maya said. Full, not conditional. We can arrange, in writing, before I say anything. She turned from the window. And I want the names on the record, all 6 of them. Full reinstatement of their service histories and official recognition of the mission's existence. She looked at Ostro. That was always the condition. You know that. I know, he said. Then we're having the same conversation we had 6 years ago in a different room, and I need to know what's different about it this time. What's different, Ostro said, is that 6 years ago the people who made the call to erase Coldfall were in positions where they could ensure the erasure held. That's no longer true. Hale is under active review, and his support structure is fracturing. He looked tired, not dramatically, but in the specific way of someone who'd been carrying something for a long time in a direction that hadn't resolved. I spent 6 years knowing you were out there somewhere, and knowing that the moment wasn't right and hating both of those things simultaneously. I'm telling you, the moment is now. She looked at him for a long time. Then her phone, the prepaid in her jacket pocket, buzzed. She pulled it out. The number on the screen was the payphone she'd called earlier. She answered immediately. The woman on the other end spoke for 45 seconds without stopping. Maya listened with the particular stillness of someone receiving information that is reorganizing everything around it. When the woman finished, Maya said, "How certain?" and listened to the answer and said, "Understood," and ended the call. She stood with the phone in her hand. "What?" Ostro said. "The analyst in San Jose wasn't working alone," she said. "He was communicating with a second party, someone inside Kestrel Bay." She looked up. This cross-reference communication records show contact with a device that pinged a cell tower within half a mile of the Naval Medical Center over the past 3 weeks. The silence was immediate and total. "Someone at the base has been feeding information," she said. "Location tracking, activity patterns." She felt the pieces align in a way that made her stomach drop. Not from fear exactly, but from the specific chill of recognizing that she'd been watched without knowing it. Someone there has been building a profile. Falk was already on her phone. Ostro was watching Maya with an expression that had moved past concern into something more like controlled urgency. "How long have you been at Kestrel Bay?" he asked, even though he already knew. 18 months, she said. "And before this morning, before I walked into that cafeteria, did anyone on that base show any behavior that, in retrospect, I don't know yet?" She cut him off, not unkindly, because she was already going back through 18 months of ordinary days in a cafeteria, running the faces, the interactions, the small things that had felt slightly off, and that she'd filed away without acting on because they'd seemed minor at the time. One thing surfaced, not a person, a pattern. A particular schedule irregularity she'd noticed 3 months ago. A staff member who arrived at inconsistent times, always with a reasonable explanation when asked, but whose movement through the cafeteria traced a path that, if you were paying the kind of attention Maya paid to spatial patterns, suggested less interest in food and more interest in the positioning of whoever was working the line. She'd noticed it. She'd filed it. She hadn't done anything with it because she'd told herself she was being paranoid, and that paranoia was the thing she had to manage most carefully in a life she'd built on being invisible. She said the name out loud to the room, not a name that meant anything to Ostro or Falk yet, just a name that was becoming newly significant. Falk was already typing, and then Maya's phone buzzed again. Different number this time, unknown, but local. She answered without speaking. The voice on the other end was distorted, deliberately, through some kind of basic modulation. But the words were clear. "We know you talked to the general," the voice said. "We know what you remember. Walk away from it, and we don't have a problem." A pause. "Don't walk away from it." The line went dead before the sentence finished. Maya lowered the phone slowly. In the room, Falk had looked up. Ostro had gone very still. "They're not guessing anymore," Maya said. "They know exactly where I am." The call lasted 4 seconds and changed everything. Maya pocketed the phone and ran the immediate math. They knew the hotel. They knew Ostro was here. They knew she'd made contact. That meant the operational window for doing anything quietly had just collapsed. Whatever controlled approach Falk had been planning, the careful, documented, bureaucratically careful approach, was no longer the timeline they were working on. "We need to move," Maya said. "Not tomorrow. Now." Falk was already on her secure phone. Her voice dropped low, requesting a location change through whatever channels she had access to. Ostro was pulling his jacket on with the stiff urgency of a man whose knee was not cooperating but who was not going to mention it. "My apartment," Maya said. "I have a packed bag there. Give me 20 minutes. "We're not splitting up," Falk said, hand over the phone. "I'm not asking for permission." She said it without heat. "You two relocate, I get my bag and my materials, and I meet you at the secondary location. If I'm not there in 40 minutes, I'm compromised and you proceed without me." She looked at Ostro. "You know I know how to move." He did know that. He nodded once. She left through the stairwell, not the elevator, and crossed the parking lot on a diagonal that kept her out of the sightline from the hotel's main entrance cameras. Not because she'd scoped the hotel in advance specifically, but because she scoped every space she spent time in as a matter of baseline habit, and that habit had stored the camera positions without her consciously asking it to. Her truck was in the far lot. She drove the long way to her apartment, running a loose surveillance detection route that added 6 minutes and confirmed nothing was following her. Not confirmation she was safe, confirmation that if she was being tracked, it was through her phone signal or a planted device rather than a tail, which was different information and required a different response. She left the prepaid on the kitchen counter when she picked up her bag, walked out with the bag and the particular cold composure that had once been trained into her, and was now simply the way she functioned when functioning was required. The secondary location was a government-leased safe house in a residential neighborhood 8 miles from the base. The kind of house that had been a safe house for long enough that it had the faint impersonal quality of a place that many different people had passed through without any of them leaving much of themselves behind. Clean surfaces, functional furniture, a kitchen that had been stocked by someone who didn't know what the occupants ate. Falk had a laptop open on the dining table when Maya arrived. The screen showed two windows side by side. One was a communication log with timestamps. The other was a personnel file that Maya recognized immediately as a Kestrel Bay Medical Center staff record. Raymond Cho, Falk said, turning the laptop. Facilities coordinator. Been at Kestrel Bay 14 months. Prior employment records are clean on the surface, but his financial activity in the last 6 months flags 3 unusual deposits that correlate with the dates of the database queries we traced. Maya looked at the photograph on the screen. She recognized the face. She'd placed it 10 minutes after she said the name out loud in the hotel room. He was quiet, unremarkable, the kind of person who moved through a workplace without generating friction. He'd spoken to her maybe 6 times in 14 months, always briefly, always in the context of some facilities question near the cafeteria. She'd noted the movement pattern. She hadn't acted on it. That was the mistake she'd live with. She filed it away rather than pulling it apart, and now the shape of it was clear. He'd been mapping her routine, her exits and entries, her shift patterns, building a location profile for someone who needed to know where she was without needing to send anyone in directly. Not yet. Is he in custody? She said. Not yet. We're trying to move carefully. If he's taken too fast, whoever he's reporting to goes dark. He's going to go dark anyway, she said. They already know I talked to Ostro. They're not waiting to see how this develops. She straightened up. Pull his communications from the last 48 hours. If he transmitted anything after Ostro walked into that cafeteria this morning, I want to know who received it. Falk made a note. Ostro was in the kitchen, not eating, just occupying the space in the way of people who needed somewhere to be while they were thinking. He came back to the doorway. Victor Hale's office issued a statement this afternoon, he said. We picked it up on the way here. He's claiming the congressional review is politically motivated, and he's calling for an independent investigator. He paused. His legal team filed 3 motions in the last week to seal additional documentation related to procurement decisions from 6 years ago. 6 years ago, Maya said. The timing isn't subtle, Ostro said. He knows the Coldfall cross-reference surfaced. He's trying to get ahead of it legally before the committee's documents and any corroborating materials can be formally introduced. How long does he have? If the motions are granted, maybe 4 weeks before any additional discovery is blocked. Falk looked up from the laptop. If we can get a documented reconstruction of the site materials you memorized, cross-referenced with the communication logs already in the committee's possession, that's a path. Not a guaranteed one, but a path. Maya sat down at the table. She pulled the laptop slightly toward her and looked at the communication log timestamps. Something in the sequence was nagging at her, not wrong exactly, but misaligned. The gaps between transmissions weren't random, they were scheduled. Regular intervals disguised by slight variations, the way you'd design a transmission pattern to look unstructured to a casual observer while actually adhering to a strict protocol. These aren't opportunistic, she said. He's been running a fixed schedule, twice weekly, with a 20-minute variance window. She traced the timestamps with one finger. This is tradecraft. Cho isn't an opportunist who got recruited. He was placed. The room was quiet in the particular way of a room where a conclusion has been reached that everyone in it already half knew, but hadn't wanted to say. 14 months, Ostro said. He was placed 4 months before I arrived, Maya said, which means whoever positioned him knew I was going to be at Kestrel Bay before I got there. She looked at Ostro. Who knew? Ostro looked uncomfortable. The relocation support that that arranged your civilian placement. I arranged my own placement, she said flatly. I took the job through the normal application. No one helped me. Someone may have known you were in the area. Bay Area regional records, utility registrations. If they had that 2 years ago, they'd have moved 2 years ago. She shook her head. Someone knew more recently, someone who had access to something more specific. She was running it backwards now, the way you worked a problem when the forward logic wasn't yielding, from the conclusion back to the starting point. The database query 8 weeks ago that surfaced the Coldfall unit designation. What preceded it? Not the query itself? What was the triggering event that made someone go looking? Falk scrolled. Typed something. Scrolled again. Her expression shifted slightly. The small, controlled shift of someone finding something they weren't expecting. Hale's review, she said slowly. The initial congressional inquiry was filed 11 weeks ago. The first sealed document request was submitted to the relevant department 10 weeks ago. She looked up. 9 weeks ago, someone ran the cold fall query. The inquiry spooked him, Maya said. He went looking for loose ends and found the unit designation and the partial personnel manifest and your name on the secondary list and tasked someone to find me. She was seeing the whole shape of it now. And whoever that was found me, positioned Cho to monitor me, and has been sitting on it for 14 months building a picture and waiting. Waiting for what? For the investigation to get close enough that I became useful. She sat back. They're not trying to silence me because I'm a threat right now. They're trying to silence me because they know the investigation is going to reach a point where I become one. Ostro sat down heavily in the chair across from her. If Hale's team has been monitoring your location for 14 months, he said, and they haven't moved against you until now, they were watching to see if anyone else would contact me first, waiting to see if the investigation would reach me through official channels. She felt the cold logic of it settle. Ostro, when you came to Kestrel Bay today, did you go through official channels? A pause. The task force knows I'm here, he said, but the specific, who knew you were going to the cafeteria specifically? Another pause, longer. I told my driver, he said quietly. He's cleared at... Get Falk to check his communications, Maya said. She wasn't angry. There was no room for anger in the space where she was currently operating, which was the space of calculating forward from the current position as fast as possible. Check his device activity from this morning between 0600 and 0900. Falk was already moving. The result came back in 11 minutes, which was fast enough that the answer was not buried. It was right there, visible, a device ping from the driver's personal phone to a number that routed through 3 relays before landing at an address associated with a consulting firm in the D.C. area that cross-referenced, when Falk ran it, with a lobbying organization that had received 2 separate large contracts from the same procurement office that was currently under congressional review. He's been inside this from the beginning, Falk said. Not the driver specifically, Maya said. He's probably just a money transaction. But the channel is confirmed. She stood. Which means this house isn't clean either. If they knew I went to the hotel, and they knew which vehicle brought Ostro here. She didn't finish the sentence because finishing it wasn't necessary. Falk was already on her secure phone again. Ostro was looking at the walls of the safe house with an expression that had moved from uncomfortable to something closer to grim. They moved to a second location within the hour. A hotel this time, different chain, paid in cash that Falk produced from a travel wallet, registered under a name that was not any of theirs. The room was on the 3rd floor, corner position, which Maya had requested without explaining why. Falk hadn't asked. Cool. They worked through the night. Not efficiently. Nothing about it was efficient, because the material was dense and the cross-referencing was painstaking, and Maya's memory, while intact, was not a searchable database. It was layered, associative, the way all human memory was, and pulling specific details in the specific order that made them legally useful required going through the context around them first. Falk documented everything. Ostro asked questions that helped Maya locate the associative threads, not because he'd been there, but because he knew the operational language and the institutional structures and could prompt the right memory with the right question. By 3 in the morning, they had 17 pages of reconstructed material. By 4:30, they had cross-referenced 8 specific transactions from the site files with the communication logs already in the Congressional Committee's secured possession, and the alignment was not marginal. It was precise. Dates, authorization codes, transfer amounts, things that could not be invented because they were too specific to be coincidental, and that could be verified against hard documentary evidence already in the committee's hands. Falk sent the first batch to a secure committee contact at 5:12 in the morning. Maya sat at the hotel room desk with coffee that had gone cold and looked at what they'd produced and felt something she wasn't fully prepared for. Not satisfaction, nothing as clean as that, more like the strange vertigo of a thing that had been held for a very long time beginning to move. She was reaching for the coffee cup when her phone rang. Not the prepaid she'd left at the apartment. The new burner Falk had provided 3 hours ago. Only Falk and Ostro had the number. She answered, and it was neither of them. The voice was male, clipped, the tone of someone accustomed to being the most significant person in the conversation. "I think we should talk directly," the voice said. "I've been told you're a reasonable person." She didn't respond. "This doesn't have to be an adversarial situation," the voice continued. "What you have in your memory? I'm not going to pretend I don't know what it is. I'm telling you that the people you're talking to are using you. They want a body to put in front of a committee. They want the information, and then they want the optics of a disgraced soldier making accusations that can be characterized later as, 'Who is this?' she said. A pause. The voice recalibrated. "Someone who can make this considerably more comfortable for you or considerably less." "Victor Hale," she said. The pause was longer this time. "I've been doing this for 30 years, the voice said. "I know how these investigations resolve. I know what happens to the witnesses when the political momentum shifts. You were already erased once. Are you confident the people who erased you the first time are genuinely different from the people who are promising you? You had 6 people killed," she said. "Not indirectly, not as collateral, specifically, deliberately, because they were in a mountain range and they found what you'd done and you needed them not to come home." The silence on the line was different from the previous ones. It was the silence of a man recalculating. "That's a very serious allegation," he said, and his voice had changed. The smooth certainty was still there, but it was working harder now, covering something. "It's not an allegation," she said. "It's what I watched happen and what I memorized and what I've been carrying for 6 years." She kept her voice level. It took effort she didn't let show. "I know the dates, I know the authorization chain, I know the financial routing, and I know the names of the officers who received orders they shouldn't have received and who followed them anyway. All of that is now in the hands of people who are not me, which means this call is the least useful thing you've done this week." The line went dead. She set the phone down on the desk and sat still for a moment, and her hands were not shaking, not exactly, but not entirely steady either, and she let them be unsteady because there was no one watching, and because 6 years of pretending that steadiness was the same as being okay was enough. And the names she said every morning were very present in the room. With her right now, in a way they often were at 4 in the morning when the thing she was carrying pressed closest to the surface. She was still sitting there when Falk came through the connecting door. The secure line was accessed, Falk said, and her face had the careful composure of someone delivering bad news with professional discipline. Not the line itself, the routing server. Someone pulled the metadata from the transmission we sent at 0512. They don't have the content, but they know the transmission occurred and they know the destination. Committee contact is compromised? Contact is being evaluated. We're rerouting. Falk paused. There's something else. She set a tablet on the desk, a news alert pulled up on the screen. 30 minutes ago, a vehicle accident on the coastal highway. Single occupant. The ID found at the scene matches Raymond Cho. Maya looked at the screen. He's dead, Falk said. Initial report is accident. Nothing about the scene is consistent with accident. The shape of what was happening sharpened further. Cho was dead because he was a thread. Someone had pulled the thread before it could be followed further. The driver was probably going to go the same way if he hadn't already. Every connection between Hale's operation and the Cold Fall cleanup was being severed, not through legal maneuvering now, but through the faster and more permanent alternative. He's panicking, Maya said. Hale's counsel filed the 4th motion to seal in the last 24 hours at 6 this morning, Falk confirmed. He's trying to lock down the legal track while simultaneously eliminating the human track. Both at once means he knows the timeline is short. Maya stood up. The unsteadiness was gone. It had done what it needed to do and passed, which was how that worked. He's going to move against the remaining Cold Fall personnel, the one in Southeast Asia and whoever the 4th person is that you haven't found yet. She looked at Falk directly. And he's going to move against anyone who can corroborate the site material, which is Ostro and you and me. We have federal protection. Cho's dead in a car accident, Maya said, not unkindly. Federal protection is not what it was yesterday. Falk held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once. She picked up her secure phone and began another call. Maya went to the window and looked out at the early morning. Dark, still, the streets wet from overnight fog. A delivery truck making slow progress down the block below. Ordinary. The world continuing its ordinary business around a situation that was anything but. Her mind was on Ostro, who was in the adjacent room and who had come to find her because he'd thought the moment was right, and who'd had a compromised driver, and who was 68 years old with a bad knee and a weight of 6 years of having made the wrong call once, and spent the intervening time trying to figure out how to undo it. She was also thinking, for the first time in a concrete way, about the fourth name on the secondary personnel list that Falk had mentioned and then left incomplete. The fourth survivor of Phantom 7 who was neither in Southeast Asia nor in a Phoenix hospital nor dead. She'd been assuming it was someone she'd lost track of. She'd been assuming the fourth person was as effectively erased as she was. She turned from the window and went to the connecting door and knocked once and opened it. Ostro was awake, sitting at the edge of the bed with his jacket off, looking at his own hands. "The fourth person on the secondary list," she said. "You said 2 were unaccounted for. 1 surfaced in Phoenix, 1 is in Southeast Asia." She waited. "Who's the fourth?" Ostro looked up at her. The expression on his face was not the tired resignation of a man delivering unwelcome news. It was something more specific than that. The expression of someone who has been carrying a particular thing and has arrived at the moment where they have no more ground to carry it on. "The fourth name on that list," he said slowly, "is the name of the officer who made the extraction call. The officer who was supposed to bring your team out and instead received a countermand order that he followed." He stopped. "He's been in protective custody for 8 months under a different identity. He came forward to the task force voluntarily." A pause. "He's the one who had the other set of copies." Maya went very still. "The copies the military thought were destroyed," Ostro said. "He carried them out. He's had them for 6 years. He didn't know what to do with them. He was—" Another stop. He was trying to figure out if there was a version of coming forward that didn't destroy everything he had left. And then the investigation started, and he made a decision. Ostro finally met her eyes. His testimony is what triggered the congressional inquiry in the first place. The room was quiet. "What's his name?" she said, and her voice was completely flat. Ostro said the name, and Maya stood in the doorway of a hotel room at 4:50 in the morning and felt something crack open in her chest that she had kept sealed for 6 years. Not grief exactly, and not relief exactly, but the specific, impossible weight of a name belonging to someone she'd believed was dead, belonging instead to a person who had been alive and carrying the same thing she'd been carrying, in a different direction, toward the same impossible destination. She put her hand on the doorframe. "He's alive," she said. It wasn't a question. "He's alive," Ostro said, "and he's been moved twice in the last week because Hale's people have been trying to find him." He paused. "He's currently at a secure location in Sacramento, and as of 1 hour ago—" He stopped, his jaw tightened. "As of 1 hour ago, we lost contact with the 2 agents assigned to his protection detail." The name Ostro had said was Daniel Rourke. Maya had last seen him alive in a mountain range 6 years ago, in the dark, during the 18 minutes between the extraction window closing and the moment she understood it wasn't going to reopen. She had believed, for 6 years, that he died in the second team's position when the southern perimeter collapsed. She had said his name every morning. She had carried his name the same way she carried the others. He was not dead. He was in Sacramento. And the 2 agents assigned to keep him that way had stopped responding an hour ago. She was already moving before Ostro finished the sentence. Back through the connecting door, past the desk where her reconstructed testimony sat in 17 pages of Falk's careful documentation, to her bag on the floor, pulling out the secondary burner she'd kept charged and separate. "I need Sacramento contact," she said to Falk. "Current safe house address." "Maya, the 2 agents went dark an hour ago. If Hale's team moved on them, they either took Rourke, or they're holding the location and waiting for him to surface somewhere else." She was pulling her jacket on. "Either way, the timeline is now. What's the address?" Falk looked at her with the particular expression of someone running a risk calculation that they already know the answer to. She pulled up the address and read it aloud once. Maya didn't write it down. "I'm going with you," Ostro said from the doorway. No. She met his eyes. You're staying here with Falk, and you're getting the documentation to the committee through a channel that hasn't been touched yet. Find one. You have people who owe you things. Call in whatever you have. She picked up her bag. If I'm not in contact within 3 hours, assume the Sacramento location is compromised and move the documentation through a secondary channel regardless. You can't go alone into but I'm not asking. She said it the same way she'd said things in rooms very different from this one, with the particular quiet finality that wasn't aggression but was not open to discussion either. You have the documentation. That's what matters. Get it where it needs to go. She left through the room's exterior door and took the stairs. The drive to Sacramento was 2 hours and change in normal conditions. She made it in 94 minutes by staying on the interstate and driving with the particular focused calm of someone who is not hurrying out of panic but out of arithmetic. The calculation that each minute on the road was a minute of unknown status for a man she'd believed was dead, in a location that was potentially compromised, surrounded by people whose job was supposed to be keeping him alive and who were not currently answering their phones. She used the drive to reconstruct what she knew about Daniel Rourke. Not the mission history, she knew that cold, but the person. He'd been 29 on Coldfall, junior in the unit but not green, methodical, the kind of person who didn't speak much during planning but whose questions, when he asked them, had a habit of identifying the specific assumption that everyone else had been treating as solid. She'd trusted him. She'd trusted all of them. That was the nature of the unit. Trust not as an emotional posture, but as a functional requirement, the same way you trusted the equipment you checked and rechecked, because your life depended on it working. He had carried the copies out. He had been alive for 6 years, carrying the same material she was carrying, and he had not surfaced, and she did not know yet whether that made her feel something toward him, or whether the feeling was something she'd have to sort out on the other side of whatever was currently happening in Sacramento. The safe house address Falk had given her was a residential street in a quiet area east of downtown, a neighborhood that had been chosen presumably for its unremarkability, the kind of block where a rented house with a government vehicle parked outside would be invisible because half the houses on the street had a similar look. She drove past it once without slowing. The government vehicle was there. The lights in the house were on. From the street, nothing looked obviously wrong, which was itself a data point, because wrong things often looked fine until you were close enough that looking fine no longer mattered. She parked 2 blocks away and approached on foot, staying on the residential side of the street, moving at the pace of someone walking home. The November morning was cold and still dark. Just past 6, the sky starting to go gray at the edges without yet committing to light. 2 houses from the safe house, she stopped and stood in the shadow of a large oak that had dropped most of its leaves and assessed what she could see. Front door closed. Lights on in front room and what appeared to be a back room. Government vehicle. A dark SUV, parked correctly, no visible occupant, no other vehicles that flagged immediately. The house's front window had the blinds closed, which was consistent with protocol but also consistent with an occupied structure where the occupants had taken control of the sightlines. She circled the block. The back of the house accessed a narrow service alley. A second vehicle was parked there, not a government vehicle, no plates visible from her angle. That was the thing she'd been looking for. People who take a position don't usually come in from the front. She stood in the alley for 40 seconds, thinking about the layout of a standard residential safe house, thinking about where 2 agents would be positioned and what positions they'd vacate if they were neutralized, thinking about where a person being held rather than guarded would be kept. She did this without hurrying, because hurrying was what got people killed when the geometry of a situation required patience, and she had learned the difference between urgency and rushing through the mechanism of having watched both produce their respective results. Then she moved. The back entrance was a utility door, locked, older mechanism. She was through it in 12 seconds and inside what turned out to be a laundry room before the door had finished settling behind her. She listened. The house was not quiet. There were 2 voices somewhere toward the front, low and controlled, the tone of people waiting and managing the tension of waiting. A single other sound, movement from what was likely the central hallway, someone pacing. She moved through the laundry room into the kitchen and she found one of the protection detail agents on the kitchen floor. He was alive. Wrists zip-tied behind him, ankles bound, a cut above his right ear that had bled significantly but had slowed. She assessed in approximately 4 seconds that he was conscious, stable, and aware of her presence, and she put a finger to her lips before he could make a sound. He nodded, tight and controlled, the nod of a professional who understood the instruction even from the floor, with blood on the side of his face. She found his sidearm in the cabinet above the refrigerator, which was where someone would put it if they'd taken it quickly and weren't planning to use it themselves. She checked it, kept it, moved back to the kitchen doorway, and assessed the hallway. 2 men between the kitchen and the front room. She could hear the positioning from the voice patterns, one near the front window, one at the midpoint of the hall. The one pacing she'd heard earlier had settled. 3, maybe 4 total. She ran the math on her angles and her options and chose the one that prioritized speed over elegance, because elegant took time she didn't have, and speed had the advantage of being harder to counter. What followed was not clean. She'd told herself a long time ago to stop expecting clean, because clean was the fantasy version, and reality had friction and pain and the specific ungainliness of 2 people struggling in a narrow hallway where neither of them had chosen the terms. The first man she reached didn't go down immediately. He was larger than she'd estimated from the voice, and he got an elbow across her left cheekbone before she put him down, and the impact was the kind that would leave a mark, and had her vision white for approximately 1 second in a way she didn't have time to accommodate. She accommodated it anyway because the alternative was stopping. The second man heard the first fall and came from the direction of the front room, and she used the hallway's narrowness against him. There was nowhere to flank in a corridor that width, and she'd had time to position herself before he reached her, and the advantage of position in confined spaces was something she'd practiced until it was reflex. He went down. The third man came from upstairs, which she hadn't expected, and he had his weapon drawn, and she was in the middle of the hallway without cover, and the mathematics of that situation were extremely clear and extremely unfavorable. "Don't," she said, and then louder, "Rourke, Daniel Rourke, if you're in this house, make a sound." A pause. The man at the top of the stairs was doing the calculation, whether she was what she looked like, whether the 2 men on the floor changed the situation enough to matter, whether the name she'd just called meant anything to him. From behind a closed door at the top of the stairs, a voice said, "Maya." Just her name. But it was his voice, older, rougher, the particular timbre of a voice that had been through things since the last time she'd heard it. But his. The man on the stairs made a decision. He brought the weapon up. She was already moving, left and low, and the shot went into the wall behind where she'd been standing, and the plaster came down in a small white shower, and she reached the stairs in 2 strides and the landing in 4. And the situation resolved in the cramped space at the top with a speed and result that left her kneeling on the landing floor with her hand pressed flat against the carpet, breathing, her cheekbone where she'd been elbowed earlier registering its objection loudly. She kicked open the door at the top of the stairs. Daniel Rourke was sitting on the floor of what had been set up as a bedroom, his hands bound in front of him with a cable tie, a bruise across his jaw that looked like it was from the last several hours rather than the last several minutes. He was 42 seconds older than the version of him she'd been carrying in her memory for 6 years, and he was alive, and he was looking at her with an expression that she didn't have a word for and that she wasn't going to try to name in the 30 seconds available. "Can you walk?" she said. "Yeah." His voice was rough. "Yeah, I can walk." She cut the cable tie with the knife from her boot, and he got to his feet with the stiffness of someone who'd been sitting bound for several hours, and he looked at her for a long moment. "I thought," he started. "I know," she said. "We have time later. Right now, we need to leave." He nodded. They went down the stairs. Tipped. She got Rourke, the conscious agent from the kitchen, and the second agent she found in the front room, bound, a mild concussion, very angry, out of the house and into her vehicle within 7 minutes. She called Falk from the road. "Rourke is secure. 2 agents need medical." She gave Falk the cross streets. "The 3 men in the safe house need federal collection, and the vehicle in the back alley needs to be traced immediately. It's the thread." "Are you I need medical backup for the agents. I'm fine. She touched her cheekbone briefly. Fine was a flexible designation. What's the status on the documentation? Transmitted 40 minutes ago through a secondary channel that Ostro confirmed clean. Congressional contact received and confirmed receipt. Falk paused. And Maya, there's been movement on the legal end in the last hour. Hale's fourth motion to seal was rejected by the federal judge at 5:58 this morning. The judge cited newly received corroborating documentation as grounds to deny. Maya let out a breath she'd been managing for a while. How long before the committee can act on it? She said. They're convening an emergency closed session at 10 this morning. Another pause. There are also federal agents en route to Hale's residence in D.C. The warrant was signed at 06:30. She checked the clock on the dash. It was 6:47. Quote, the next 4 hours had the particular quality of a situation that had been moving fast and suddenly had to learn how to move through institutions, which were slower and more friction-filled and required a different kind of patience. She got the two agents to a hospital, not Kestrel Bay, a civilian facility nearby where the intake was handled quietly with Falk's coordination. She sat with Rourke in a federal building conference room while a task force attorney took his initial statement, and she watched him speak, and she listened to the chronology of 6 years that she hadn't known about, the extraction, the choice he'd made, the 6 years of carrying the copies of documents that could destroy a man powerful enough that destroying him required 6 years of waiting and a congressional inquiry and a dead analyst in San Jose and a cafeteria worker in California who ran 5 miles every morning and said 6 names before the sun came up. He'd made choices she didn't agree with. She'd spent 6 years believing he was dead, and he'd spent 6 years knowing she wasn't, and he hadn't found her, and she was still working out what she felt about that. It wasn't simple. She hadn't expected it to be simple. When the attorney paused the session for a break, Rourke looked across the table at her and said, I looked for you the first year. I didn't find you. I was buried deep, she said. I know. I figured. He looked at his hands. The bruise on his jaw had darkened. I didn't know how to come forward without... I kept thinking there would be a right moment, and it kept not being the moment. Until the inquiry. Until the inquiry. Yeah. A pause. I'm sorry it took this long. She thought about that. The copies you carried out, if you'd surfaced them earlier, I know. The Hamburg asset might still be alive. He absorbed that without deflecting it, which was the right response. He sat with it. I know, he said again quietly. She didn't push it further. The weight of it was his to carry, and he clearly already was, and adding to it didn't produce anything useful. She understood the calculus of a person who kept waiting for the right moment and kept finding reasons the moment wasn't right, because she'd done versions of the same thing, and she understood that understanding it didn't dissolve the cost. The 6 of them, she said. They're records. That's the first thing I asked for, when I came forward, before anything else. He looked at her directly. I wasn't going to let that be a condition. It was the precondition. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. At 10:14 in the morning, the closed congressional session received the full reconstructed testimony, cross-referenced with Rourke's documentary evidence and the existing communication logs, and the cross-referencing produced what the committee's lead counsel later described to a journalist as an unusually complete evidentiary picture. That was the public description, chosen for its dryness. The private description, which Maya heard secondhand from Falk, was more direct. At 11:03, federal agents arrested Victor Hale at his residence. He did not go quietly, in the sense that his legal team was on the phone before the agents reached his front door, and the argument in the driveway lasted 22 minutes. But he was in federal custody before noon. Maya was not watching it happen. She was in a federal building in Sacramento, at a different conference table working through her own formal statement with a committee attorney and a federal prosecutor who were both careful, thorough, and significantly more comfortable with the situation than they'd apparently been at 7 that morning before the warrant was signed. She answered everything they asked. She answered it accurately and completely, and in the specific, ordered way she'd memorized things. And when the attorney flagged a detail for clarification, She clarified without defensiveness or embellishment, because the thing she wanted from this was the thing she'd always wanted, and that thing required the record to be clean. The session ran 4 hours. At the end of it, the prosecutor leaned back in his chair and said, with the careful understatement of his profession, "This is significant." "Yes," she said. "I want to be clear that what you've provided, both the testimony and the corroborating cross-references, is material to a federal criminal case. That's going to mean a formal process, depositions, potentially trial testimony." "I understand." "And the immunity agreement has been signed and witnessed," she said. "I know what I'm agreeing to." He nodded. He looked at her for a moment in the way people sometimes looked at her when they were recalibrating their previous understanding of who they were dealing with. She'd seen that look a lot in the last 36 hours. "Can I ask you something? Off the record?" She waited. 18 months in a cafeteria, he said, while you were carrying all of this. "I was good at the job," she said. And then, because she was tired and the answer deserved more than the deflection, it was the right distance. I could see the thing from there, without it consuming everything. He absorbed that. He didn't push further. He closed the folder on the table and thanked her, and she thanked him back, and she went into the corridor where Ostro was waiting with 2 cups of coffee, one of which he held out to her. She took it. It was still warm. They stood in the corridor for a moment, not talking. Outside the window at the end of the hall, Sacramento was going through a regular Thursday morning. Traffic, people, the ordinary persistence of a city that didn't know what was happening in a conference room on its eastern edge. "Hale's in custody," Ostro said. "I heard. His counsel will push for bail. They'll probably get a hearing by tomorrow." He paused. "But the evidentiary package, with both your testimony and Rourke's documentation and the communication logs, so the prosecutor I spoke to said the case is as complete as he's seen." "As complete as he's seen isn't airtight," she said. "No, it's not." He wrapped his hands around his own cup. "Nothing is airtight until it's done. You know that." She did know that. "The restoration process for the unit records," she said. "The 6 names. Where does that stand?" "I filed the formal request with the Records Division 2 hours ago. With the mission now officially acknowledged under the evidence submission, the administrative basis for the original erasure is invalidated. It goes through a review, but it's not a long process anymore." He looked at her. "It should be done within 30 days. 30 days. She turned that number over. 30 days before the names she said every morning had an official place in the record, before they existed in a form that didn't require her to be their only evidence. She drank the coffee. It was good coffee, which was unexpected. "Masso called me this morning," Ostro said. She looked at him. "Lieutenant Callahan. Derek Masso." Ostro looked almost amused, which was a new color for his face. "He got my contact through the base administration. He apparently spent most of yesterday trying to piece together what happened." A pause. "He wanted to know if there was a way to apologize that would actually mean something." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that wasn't something I could answer for you." She thought about Derek Masso standing in the mess hall with his easy confidence and the eggs going rubbery in the steam trays. And she thought about the look on his face afterward, and about the apology in the cafeteria at the end of that day. Stripped of performance, just a young officer who'd been a fool and knew it. "He's not the problem," she said. "He never was." "I know." Ostro paused. "He did ask one other thing. He wanted to know if he and his unit could come to the formal recognition ceremony, when it happens." He waited. "When the names are restored." She looked out the window at the end of the corridor for a moment. "That's not my decision," she said. "That belongs to their families." She looked back at her coffee. "But I'll ask." By 4 in the afternoon, the story had moved, partially, carefully, in the way that federal actions moved when they were real and ongoing, rather than concluded. Not a full account, not the classified details, but the shape of it. A senior defense official in federal custody. A sealed congressional investigation, an evidentiary submission described by committee sources as significant and corroborated. Falk texted her. Hale's legal team withdrawing 2 of the 4 seal motions, reading the room, then 20 minutes later. 4th motion withdrawn, all 4 gone. That was the tell. Legal teams didn't withdraw motions they believed in. They withdrew motions they'd been told were no longer the right strategy, which meant someone in Hale's inner circle had looked at the evidentiary package and made the assessment that fighting it document by document was not the path that ended better for him, which was its own form of confirmation. She was in the hotel Falk had booked for her. Different hotel, different chain. She'd paid for it herself this time, which felt important for reasons she wasn't going to analyze in depth. When her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize, she almost didn't answer. She answered because the area code was local to a region she'd just spent the day in, and because the last 24 hours had adjusted her threshold for what was worth responding to. "Ms. Reyes," the voice said. Male, older, unfamiliar. "My name is Senator Carol Briggs. I chair the committee that received your testimony today." A pause. "I wanted to call personally. What you provided, the precision of it, the consistency with the independent documentation. I've been in this job 19 years, and I want you to know that what happened today in that room will not be lost." She sat down on the edge of the hotel bed. "The names," she said. "The 6 individuals from the unit, their families. We're already in contact with the families. With your testimony and the submitted documentation, the administration's legal position regarding the original classified designation is..." He paused. "Let's just say it won't hold. The names will be on the record." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. She meant it without complication, which was rarer than she'd have thought. "Thank you," he said. "Get some rest." She sat for a while after the call ended. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the city was going into evening, lights coming on, the sky moving through the particular sequence of color that November evenings had here, the last orange-gray above the horizon before it went dark. She thought about the mess hall at Kestrel Bay. She thought about the steam trays and the overcooked eggs, and the ordinary invisibility of 18 months spent serving food to people who didn't look at her, and about how the distance of that had been, as she'd told the prosecutor, the right distance, close enough to see the shape of the thing she'd been carrying, far enough that she hadn't been consumed by it. She thought about going back, not as a question exactly, more as a presence in her mind, the weight of an unresolved thing sitting beside everything else. Her phone buzzed again. Falk this time. One more thing. Hale's communications for the last 48 hours. Federal team is going through them now. There's a contact they flagged in the last 30 minutes. A name that's come up in the Cold Fall records before, but never as a principal. Maya looked at the message. The name is Briggs. She read it twice. Committee chair. The call that was just placed to your phone. It went through his office line. The federal team says the communication pattern between Briggs's encrypted personal device and Hale's counsel in the last 72 hours is a pause in the message, the rhythm of someone choosing words carefully, even in text. Maya, the committee chair, has been feeding Hale's legal team the timeline of the evidence submission process in real time. She stood up from the edge of the bed. The man who had just called her to say the names would be on the record had been telling Hale's team, in real time, what the committee had and when they had it, which meant the 4 motions to seal hadn't been Hale reading the room. They'd been Hale reading a map that someone on the inside was drawing for him, which meant the withdrawal of those motions wasn't capitulation. It was a pivot. Her phone buzzed again. The documentation package we submitted this morning, Briggs signed off on its routing to the secure evidence repository. Federal team can't confirm the package is intact in the repository. They're checking now. She was already moving, jacket on, bag up, the particular controlled speed of someone who has been in motion for 36 hours and is not stopping because the mathematics require continuation, and the mathematics were always what she followed when everything else became too loud. She had the door open when the phone rang again. Different number, unknown. She answered. "You made a mistake," the voice said, distorted again, the same modulation as the call the night before. "You thought the committee was the finish line." A pause. "The documentation you submitted this morning doesn't exist anymore, not in any form that can be introduced in a federal proceeding, and the committee member who received your testimony today is about to formally recuse himself on the grounds of a conflict of interest that will require..." that will require the investigation to pause while a replacement chair is appointed. She stood in the doorway of the hotel room. That process, the voice continued, takes 6 to 8 weeks, during which time the evidentiary record is sealed pending the transition, during which time the physical copies of your testimony are held in administrative sequester. A pause. Mr. Hale's legal team will file for dismissal on procedural grounds on Monday morning. By the time the committee reconvenes, if it reconvenes, the window for the federal arrest warrant will have expired. She said nothing. Walk away, the voice said. You're free. You've done remarkable things. Walk away and stay free. She held the phone and thought about 6 names. She thought about Daniel Rourke in a chair at the top of a staircase with his hands bound. She thought about a woman in Hamburg who was dead because someone with power and resources and the patience to wait had spent 6 years managing the cleanup of a thing he'd done. No, she said. The line went dead. She stood in the doorway and she felt the shape of what she was standing inside. The trap of it, the way it had closed around not just her, but around everything she'd spent 36 hours building. The specific cruelty of a mechanism designed not to stop a thing through force, but to stop it through process. Through the particular grinding patience of institutional power when it decided to consume rather than confront. And she thought about the one thing she had that the mechanism hadn't accounted for. Not the testimony, not the documentation. Those were inside the system now, and the system had been turned against them. What she had was the original source. What she had was 6 years of carrying something in her memory that no administrative process could sequester, and no legal maneuver could introduce a chain of custody problem into, because the chain of custody was her nervous system, and the only way to break it was to break her. And they had tried that too, which meant they were running out of options. She called Falk. The documentation is compromised, she said. I know. I need you to find me a journalist with the right clearances and the right editorial infrastructure to handle classified adjacent material responsibly. Not a leak. A formal documented interview on the record tonight. She paused. If we can't put it through the committee, we put it through the public record. Let them try to sequester a testimony that's already been published. Falk was quiet for 2 seconds. That changes things significantly. It changes things in the right direction, Maya said. How fast can you find someone? Give me 30 minutes. You have 20, she said, and stepped out into the hallway and let the door close behind her. Falk called back in 16 minutes. The journalist's name was Patricia Wren. She was a national security correspondent for a publication that had the legal infrastructure and editorial precedent to handle sensitive government material. Not because they published everything they received, but because they had the specific institutional experience of knowing what they could defend, what they could verify, and how to build a publication around documentation that was going to be contested the moment it appeared. She had the relevant security background clearances from previous reporting. She had a lawyer on retainer who specialized in exactly this category of material. And she was, Falk said, already in Sacramento, had been for 2 days, working a separate story that was adjacent enough to the Cold Fall territory that she'd been flagged internally as a potential resource if the committee route failed. Maya met her at 11 that night in a restaurant that was still open, in a corner booth away from the window, and she sat down across from a woman in her mid-40s who had the particular quality of stillness that belonged to people who spent their careers listening to things that were difficult to hear and had learned not to fill the silence prematurely. I know some of what you're going to tell me, Wren said. I've been working the Hale procurement angle for 6 months, not the Cold Fall piece. I didn't know that existed, but the financial architecture. She set a recorder on the table. Can I? You can, Maya said. She talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Wren asked questions that were precise and well-informed, which helped. She wasn't filling in gaps with assumption. She was using what she already knew to locate exactly where Maya's account intersected with the documentary trail she'd been building separately. And the intersections were numerous and specific, and when they arrived at each one, had the particular quality of a lock clicking open. At 1:17 in the morning, Wren sat back and looked at her notes. The documentation the committee received this morning, if it's been administratively suppressed, that's a story in itself, she said. Evidence tampering in a federal investigation. It is, Maya said, but it's the secondary story. The primary story is the record of what happened to 6 people in a mountain range and who authorized it and why. Wren looked at her. Publishing this will be... It's going to be contested immediately. Hale's legal team will file injunctions. The committee situation with Briggs means there will be procedural arguments about... I know, Maya said. Publish it anyway. It could take months to fully... I've been waiting 6 years. Months is fine. She held the journalist's gaze. What I need is for the information to be in the public record in a form that can't be administratively sequestered. Once it's published, it's published. The legal process can argue about the committee timeline as long as it wants. The record exists. Wren was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. My editor is going to want 2 additional corroborating sources for the Cold Fall operational claims. Daniel Rourke will speak to you. General Ostro will speak to you. She paused. And I can provide you with the specific coordinates and operational dates that can be cross-referenced against declassified satellite imagery from the relevant period. The imagery is in the public domain. It was released as part of an unrelated declassification package 3 years ago. Your research team can verify the site locations against what I give you. Wren wrote something down. How long before I can reach Rourke? Tomorrow morning. I'll make sure of it. She walked out of the restaurant at 1:58 in the morning. The Sacramento night was cold and clear, the fog that lived on the coast not reaching this far inland, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed the cold air and let herself feel briefly and without trying to manage it, the specific enormity of what was in motion. Not satisfaction, it wasn't done yet, and she'd been too long in the business of things not being done to feel satisfaction prematurely. More like the recognition that the weight she'd been carrying had, for the first time in 6 years, begun to be distributed to other hands, that it was no longer entirely hers to hold. She took a breath, then she called Rourke. He answered on the second ring, which told her he hadn't been sleeping. I need you to talk to a journalist tomorrow morning, she said. A pause. Okay, he said. He didn't ask why or negotiate it. Just, okay. She filed that away. Get some sleep, she said. You too, he said. And then, after a brief quiet, Maya, I'm glad you're alive. She stood on the sidewalk with the phone in her hand after the call ended. The streetlights made amber pools on the empty pavement. Somewhere down the block, a car passed without slowing. Yeah, she said to no one in particular. Me too. The article published at 6:15 the following morning. It ran long, nearly 4,000 words, with a secondary piece on the financial architecture of Hale's procurement decisions and a third piece on the administrative suppression of congressional evidence that the publication's legal team had pre-cleared through the night. The editorial team had worked from midnight to publication without stopping, which Patricia Wren would later describe as one of the 3 or 4 most important nights of her professional life, in the particular understated way of someone who meant it fully but wasn't going to dramatize it. By 8 in the morning, it had been shared 40,000 times. By 9, Hale's legal team had filed an emergency injunction to have the article removed from publication, which the publication's lawyers contested in a filing that arrived at the relevant federal court before the injunction was formally processed, which meant the injunction sat in a procedural queue for 6 hours, while the article continued to circulate, which was long enough. By 10:30, 3 additional news organizations had independently confirmed the core Cold Fall claims through their own reporting, using the satellite imagery cross-reference that Maya had given Wren as the verification pathway. Once 3 organizations with independent editorial processes arrived at the same factual conclusion from different directions, the legal mechanism for suppression became, in practical terms, a theoretical exercise rather than a functional one. Senator Carroll Briggs resigned his committee chairmanship at 11:04, citing personal reasons, in a statement released by his office that mentioned no specifics. The resignation lasted 4 hours before the FBI announced he was being interviewed in connection with the evidence suppression inquiry, which made the personal reasons explanation considerably less ambiguous in the public understanding. Victor Hale's legal team withdrew their dismissal filing at 1 in the afternoon. Maya heard about that one from Falk by text. with no additional commentary, which was the right amount of commentary. She was at a gas station on the edge of Sacramento when the text arrived, filling the tank on her truck, and she stood there with the pump handle in her hand and read the text twice and then looked at the sky, which was clear and flat and blue in the particular way of Northern California in November when the fog lifts and the light comes through clean and cold. She didn't do anything dramatic. She put the pump back and got her receipt and got back in the truck and drove. She had somewhere to be. Mab. The formal record restoration for the 6 members of Phantom 7 did not take 30 days. It took 11 because the administrative basis for the original erasure had, as Ostro had predicted, collapsed completely once the mission was officially acknowledged in the federal evidence record. And what remained was a bureaucratic process that moved faster when it didn't have institutional resistance behind it. The Records Division processed the reinstatements in order, and each name appeared in the official personnel record with its full service history and operational commendations, and each family received notification by hand-delivered letter from a representative of the branch. Maya was not present for those notifications. She'd asked to not be. It wasn't her place, she felt, to be in the room for a family's first encounter with a truth they'd been denied for 6 years. That was private. That belonged to them before it belonged to anything else. She'd written letters to each family, handwritten, which had taken her 3 days and multiple drafts each, because there was no good version of what she had to say, and she was going to say it as honestly as she could, regardless. She said what she knew. She said what had happened. She said their names the way they deserved to be said, not as footnotes or classified references, but as people, specific and irreplaceable, who had been in a place together and had done something that mattered and had not come home, and who had mattered before and after and would continue to. She mailed the letters and waited. The first response came 9 days later, from the sister of Marcus Webb, who had been 26 on Cold Fall and who Maya had known as the quietest person in any room until he had something worth saying, at which point everyone stopped to listen. The sister's letter was 2 pages, handwritten in return, and it said things that Maya read once, and then folded and kept and did not read again for a long time, because once was the right amount for now. The others wrote too, eventually. Not all of them. Some things are too large to answer with a letter, and silence is also a response that deserves respect. But enough. Archet. Hale's federal trial was not scheduled to begin for 8 months. The charges that the federal prosecutor presented in the indictment covered a range that was, when Maya read through the formal document, broader than she'd anticipated. Procurement fraud, conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation, unauthorized disclosure of classified intelligence to non-cleared parties, and 3 counts related to the operation itself, worded with the careful legal precision of charges that the prosecutor believed he could prove and was committed to proving. The indictment named 4 additional individuals as co-conspirators, 2 of whom were former military officers, and 2 of whom were private contractors whose companies had received the procurement decisions that were at the center of Hale's financial corruption. Briggs was charged separately: obstruction, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. His attorney released a statement indicating he intended to cooperate with the investigation, which was the legal way of saying he'd been offered something in exchange for information and had accepted, which was its own form of conclusion. Maya did not follow the legal proceedings daily. She'd learned in the months between the publication of the article and the indictments that there was a version of following something that became its own trap, where the waiting and the checking and the measuring of each development against the expected resolution became a way of not living in any particular direction. She'd spent enough years in one kind of trap without voluntarily constructing another. She went back to Kestrel Bay, not to the cafeteria, not permanently, not with the apron and the steam trays, but she went back because there was an unfinished quality to the place for her, and because she believed in finishing things where they started, and because Garfield had texted her 3 weeks after the article ran to say that if she wanted her shifts back, they were hers, which was the kindest and most matter-of-fact response she'd gotten from anyone in the initial period, and she'd laughed for the first time in weeks at the specific ordinariness of it. She didn't take the shifts back, but she went back. The base administration had been in contact about a separate matter, a formal commendation process that she'd agreed to attend, which she'd agreed to with the specific resignation of someone who understood that these things were necessary and meaningful to other people, and that her own discomfort with being seen was not sufficient reason to deprive those people of something that mattered to them. She drove back up the coast on a Thursday morning, 3 months after the day Ostro had walked into the mess hall, and she parked in the same spot she'd parked in for 18 months, and she sat in the truck for a moment looking at the building. It looked exactly the same. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Ostro met her at the entrance. He was in uniform, the first time she'd seen him in uniform since before Coldfall, and it suited him in the way that things suit people who've worn them long enough that the garment and the person have reached an accommodation. He looked better than he had in Sacramento, less compressed. "How's the knee?" she said. "Terrible," he said. "Same as always." He held the door. "Ready?" "No," she said. "Good," he said. "Me neither. Let's go." The commendation ceremony was in the base's main assembly room, which had been arranged for the occasion with the particular military formality that she'd always had a complicated relationship with, the part of her that had trained within it and understood its function, and the part that had been erased by it and knew what it cost when the institution failed the standards it ceremonially upheld. Both parts were present as she walked into the room. The room was full. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected the formal minimum, ceremony staff, a few command representatives, the requisite documentation. What she found was closer to capacity, and the faces in it were a mixture she hadn't anticipated: base personnel, medical staff, several people she didn't recognize who turned out to be family members of the Phantom 7 unit who had traveled, some of them from significant distances, to be present. She stopped inside the door. Daniel Rourke was in the third row. He looked at her when she came in and nodded, and she nodded back, and that exchange contained more than she would have known how to articulate, and so she didn't try. Derek Masso was in the fifth row. He was in uniform, sitting straight, and when her eyes found him, he did something she hadn't expected. He looked directly at her and held the look, not with the easy confidence of the man she'd first seen behind a steam tray, but with something quieter and more considered. She looked at him for a moment, then she moved forward. The ceremony itself was formal and in parts difficult. The official recognition of the Phantom 7 unit was read into the public record by a uniformed officer whose voice was careful and deliberate, and each name was said aloud, and the room was quiet for each one. And Maya stood through all of it with her hands still at her sides, and her face composed and the specific cost of composure very present. When her own commendation was read, she was not prepared for the specific language of it. Not because it was unexpected in structure, military commendations being a form she knew well, but because the language that described what she'd done and what had been done to her was accurate and unsparing in a way that official language rarely was. Someone had written it carefully. She found out later that Rourke had written the first draft. She received the commendation from a base commander she'd never met, and she shook his hand and she looked at the document in her hands for a moment, and she thought about the apron she'd worn for 18 months and the eggs that were always overcooked by 7:15, and the particular art of being invisible that she'd practiced until it was as natural as breathing. She had been very good at being invisible. She was done with that now. After the ceremony, there was a reception. Food she didn't particularly eat, conversation she navigated carefully, several moments of being thanked by people she'd never met in ways that required her to receive the thanks without deflecting or minimizing, which was its own kind of discipline. The family members were the hardest, not because they were difficult to speak with. They weren't. They were kind and honest, and they said what they'd come to say without performance. But because every conversation was also a conversation with an absence, with the person who should have been there and wasn't. And that weight didn't lift simply because the record had been set right. Setting the record right didn't bring anyone back. She'd always known that. It was still worth doing. Both things were true simultaneously, and neither canceled the other. Marcus Webb's sister found her near the window at the edge of the reception room. Her name was Claudine, and she was several years older than Marcus had been. And she had his quality of stillness, the same composure that resolved into precision when she spoke. "Thank you for the letter," Claudine said. "I meant everything in it," Maya said. "I know you did." Claudine looked at her for a moment. "He talked about you before, in the time before the mission. He said you were the most capable person in any room you walked into and that nobody ever noticed until it was too late. She paused. He said it with admiration. Maya looked at the window. Outside, the bay was visible between the buildings, gray-green in the December light. He was one of the most capable people I've known, she said. He just did it quietly. He got that from our mother, Claudine said, and there was something in her voice that was grief and affection and the particular warmth of a specific memory, all at once, and Maya recognized it as the most honest thing anyone had said to her all day. They stood there for a moment, the two of them, looking out at the bay. The reception continued around them, with its noise and its movement, and they were briefly outside of it, in the particular stillness of people who have found something shared in a place they didn't expect to find it. Maso found her before she left. She was outside, by her truck, jacket on, processing the day in the only way that worked for her, which was motion and cold air, and not being in a room full of people. She heard him coming. He wasn't trying to be quiet, which she appreciated. "Can I have 2 minutes?" he said. "You have 2 minutes," she said. He stood there for a moment, in the specific, awkward honesty of someone who has thought very carefully about what they want to say, and is now realizing that thought doesn't guarantee execution. "I said something stupid in that mess hall 3 months ago," he said. "I've said stupid things in a lot of mess halls, I'm sure, but that one I've thought about every day since." "I know," she said. "I didn't see you." He said it directly, without softening it into something easier to carry. "You were right there and I didn't see you, and I made it worse because I didn't see you and I wanted the room to see me instead." He paused. I don't have a better explanation. I'm not going to dress it up." She looked at him. He was young, and he was genuinely trying, and he was not the enemy and had never been the enemy. He was the ordinary version of a failure that people committed 100 times a day without consequence. And the reason his had landed was the specific context of her life and what she'd been carrying, not any particular cruelty in him. That didn't mean it didn't matter. It just meant it was the right size. "You asked if your unit could come to the ceremony," she said. "General Ostro mentioned, I know, I asked him to tell you yes." She looked at him steadily. "Not because what you said didn't matter, because it did, but because the ceremony was about something bigger than that, and I wanted you there to understand what bigger looks like." She paused. "Did you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I did." She nodded. She opened the truck door. "Miss Reyes." He used her name, not her rank. She had no current rank, and there was a weight of attention in it. "What happens now, for you?" She considered the question. It was an honest one. "I've been offered a training position," she said. "Consulting role with a joint task force, working with medics and field personnel on the kind of practical knowledge that doesn't fit in a manual." She paused. "I haven't decided yet." "What would you decide if you weren't thinking about whether you deserved it?" She looked at him. He had the grace to look like he wasn't entirely sure why he'd said it. "Sorry, that was—" "No," she said. "That was a good question." She thought about it for a real moment, not the performative moment of appearing to consider something she'd already decided. "If I wasn't thinking about deserving, I'd say yes. Because the people who need that training are going to go into places like the place where I lost my team. And the difference between knowing what they're doing and not knowing is a difference that matters in the way that the most permanent things matter." Maso nodded slowly. "Then say yes," he said. "That's my 2 cents, which probably isn't worth a lot." She got in the truck. "It's worth something," she said, and closed the door. She sat in the truck for a moment before starting it. Through the windshield, she could see the corner of the cafeteria building, the wing that housed the mess hall, the ordinary institutional exterior of a place where she had spent 18 months serving eggs and being invisible. The building was unremarkable. It looked exactly like what it was. She started the truck. She said yes to the position in January. It took her 3 weeks after the ceremony to make the decision, and she made it the way she made all her decisions that mattered, by sitting with it until the noise quieted and then listening to what was left when it did. What was left was the image of Petty Officer Commons on the floor of the corridor, the specific color of his face, and the angle of his airway and the way his body had responded when she'd corrected it, and what it would have meant if she hadn't been there. What was left was Daniel Rourke at the top of a staircase. What was left was 6 years of a particular distance she'd maintained because it had been necessary, and the question of what she did now that it no longer was. She said yes. The Joint Task Force's training program operated out of a facility 300 miles north, and she relocated in February with the same efficiency she'd packed every bag in her adult life. Fast, functional, nothing she'd miss. Rourke was working with a different arm of the same organization. They talked twice a week, sometimes about work, sometimes not. That relationship was going to take time to be whatever it was going to be, and she'd decided to let it take time rather than forcing it into a shape, which was, she thought, the right approach to most things that mattered. Ostro called her on the last day of February to tell her that the primary federal case against Hale had been set for trial and that the prosecutor's office was formally requesting her trial testimony, which she'd agreed to when she signed the immunity documentation and was agreeing to again now without condition. He also told her, almost as an aside, that the medical team at a Phoenix hospital had confirmed the recovery of the fourth Phantom 7 survivor, the one who'd been brought in with acute poisoning symptoms, and that the individual was going to make a full recovery and had been connected with the same attorney who'd represented Rourke during his cooperation with the task force. "All 4 of you," Ostro said. "Still here." "Still here," she said. She was running when he called, 5 miles, the same route she'd run every morning since she moved north, which wound through a residential area and then along a ridge that looked out over a valley that was green in February in a way that her eyes still hadn't fully adjusted to expecting. She'd stopped at the ridge's high point to take the call, and she stood there in the cold morning with the valley spread below her and the phone warm in her hand and the sound of Ostro's voice, tired and real and carrying its own kind of accumulated weight. "Thank you," she said, "for coming to the cafeteria." A pause. "I should have come sooner." "Yes," she said, "but you came." She ended the call and stood for a moment on the ridge. The valley below was quiet. Morning light coming down the eastern slope, the kind of light that was still new enough to have clarity in it before the day's accumulation of heat and haze. She could see a long way from up here. She'd been choosing positions with good sight lines for so long it was reflexive, but lately she'd started to notice it wasn't only tactical. There was something she needed about being able to see far, not because she was looking for threats, but because the distance itself was clarifying, because it was easier to understand the shape of things when you could see enough of them. She said the 6 names. She said them the way she always said them, in the order she'd settled on years ago, not alphabetical, not by seniority, but by the sequence in which she could feel them most clearly, the order that made them most present. She said them into the cold morning air, not loudly, just with the specific weight of naming something that deserved to be named. 6 names, each one a whole person. Each one still present in the way that people remain present when they are remembered accurately, not sanitized, not reduced to what they accomplished, but whole, with their particular qualities and their imperfections and the specific texture of what it had been like to be in a place with them, and trust your life to them and know, without having to say it, that the trust was returned. She finished and stood in the quiet for a moment. Then she ran back down the ridge. Tut. The trial of Victor Hale began on a Tuesday in March and ran for 6 weeks. Maya testified on the 9th day. She entered the courtroom in civilian clothes, which had been her choice, and she sat in the witness chair and answered the questions the prosecutor asked with the same precision she'd brought to every room she'd been in since this began, not performing composure, not straining after it, just present and clear and saying what she knew. Hale's defense counsel cross-examined her for 4 hours. She answered every question directly. When the questioning became designed to create confusion through repetition, she said simply, "That's the same question phrased differently, and my answer is the same." When the defense implied her memory was unreliable or motivated, she cited the specific cross-references between her testimony and the independent documentary evidence and let the precision of the alignment speak for itself. When counsel suggested that a person who had been effectively erased by the military, had reason to construct a narrative against those responsible. She agreed that she had reason and then explained why having reason and constructing a narrative were different things and what the difference was. The defense ran out of angles after 4 hours. She stepped down from the stand and walked out of the courtroom and stood in the corridor and let herself feel the weight lifting. Not all of it, not instantly, not the way it happened in movies where a single moment resolves everything. More like the specific relief of putting down something very heavy after carrying it for a long time. The absence of the weight first, before anything else. Falk was waiting in the corridor. She'd come down from wherever the task force was currently based, which was somewhere Maya still didn't know and Falk still didn't disclose. And she was standing with 2 cups of coffee in the particular way she'd had of producing coffee at moments that required it, which Maya had come to recognize as one of her most underrated qualities. "How'd it go?" Falk said. "Fine," Maya said, and took the coffee, and meant it without qualification. The verdict came 41 days after the trial concluded. Guilty on 11 of 13 counts. The 2 that didn't land were technical, related to the specific wording of authorization chains that the defense had successfully complicated beyond the jury's reasonable certainty threshold, but the 11 that did included the core charges, the ones that mattered in the way that the most permanent consequences mattered. Hale received a sentence that the judge read into the record with the careful specificity of someone who wanted the reasoning to be undeniable, and the sentencing statement mentioned, explicitly, the 6 individuals whose records had been suppressed and whose families had been denied the truth for 6 years, and their names were read aloud in the courtroom on the day of sentencing. Maya sat in the gallery and listened to their names being said by a federal judge in a room full of people, official and irreversible, part of the public record forever. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying elsewhere, in the private way of someone who'd had to learn to keep the private things private for so long that the habit didn't dissolve overnight, and maybe wouldn't entirely dissolve, and that was okay. Some things become structural. You learn to live in them differently rather than expecting them to disappear. What she felt, sitting in that gallery, was something closer to the particular stillness that came after a thing that had been moving for a very long time finally stopped. Not peace, exactly. Peace implied the absence of difficulty, and her life did not have that, and she didn't expect it to. But stillness. The specific kind that arrives when you've carried a thing as far as it needed to go, and you've set it down in the right place. She walked out of the courthouse into afternoon light. She still ran 5 miles every morning. She still said the 6 names before the sun came up, because that was not a practice she intended to stop. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but because they deserved to be said, and she was still a person who could say them, and that was a reason to keep going every morning, in whatever place she was in, on whatever kind of ground was under her feet. What changed was smaller and larger than the obvious things. It was the way she walked into a room now. Still aware of sight lines, still registering exits, probably always that, but without the specific internal calculation about how long she could stay before being seen. She had stopped calculating that, or she was learning to stop. It was a process. She kept the tattoos. She'd always kept them, but there was a difference now in how she carried them, not as the secret evidence of a thing that couldn't be named, but as what they'd always actually been, coordinates of real places where real things had happened, a unit designation that was now in the official record, numbers that belonged to a history that existed publicly and permanently. They meant the same thing they'd always meant. She was just no longer the only person who knew what they meant. One morning in early April, she was at the ridge, the high point on her running route, the one with the long view over the valley, when her phone rang. She almost didn't answer because she was 2 miles from the end of her run, and the morning was clear in the specific way of early spring that she was still adjusting to after years on the coast, and she wanted to finish the run in that light without interruption. She answered anyway. It was Claudine Webb, Marcus's sister. "I hope I'm not—" "No," Maya said. "It's fine. It's good to hear from you. I wanted to tell you something. It's been sitting with me since the sentencing." A pause. When the judge read Marcus's name, and all of their names, I was watching the room, and there were people in that room who didn't know them, people who were there professionally or because it was news or whatever. And when the names were read, those people, some of them, they stopped. They went still for a second, like the names landed. Her voice was steady, but carrying something. I'd been afraid for 6 years that they'd be forgotten, that even if the record was corrected, they'd still just be administrative language, a footnote. Maya looked out over the valley. They're not a footnote, Claudine said. Because of what you did, they're not a footnote. Maya was quiet for a moment. The valley below was green and long, and the light was coming down the eastern slope clean and new. He made sure I got out, she said finally. In the mountain, before the perimeter, Marcus positioned the team so there was a way out for me. I don't know if he chose it consciously or if it was just how he thought tactically, but there was a way out, because of how he set it up. She paused. I've thought about that every day for 6 years. Claudine was quiet on the other end. He would have said it was procedure, Maya said. He would have, Claudine agreed, and there was something almost like a smile in her voice underneath the grief, specific and real. They talked for a few more minutes, about ordinary things mostly, the kind of ordinary that exists on the other side of large events when people are trying to find out how to be in the same world as each other without the urgency of the large event holding them together. It was a little uncertain, a little clumsy, the way all beginnings were when they arrived after something else had ended. It was enough. Maya finished the run when the call ended. She ran back down the ridge with the morning opening up around her, the valley going gold where the light reached it, a cold wind coming from the north that would drop off by midday, the ground firm under her feet. She ran the way she'd always run, not from anything, not toward anything specific, just with the particular discipline of someone who understood that the body's ability to carry weight depended on the same things that everything else depended on. The commitment to show up every day, to do the work that kept you functional, to maintain the capability for whatever was coming without knowing what that was. She had been dismissed and erased and invisible. She had been the woman behind the counter, the one they didn't see, the one with the strange tattoos and the flat effect and the 7-hour shifts and the truck parked 12 minutes from the base. And she had carried 6 names and 6 years of evidence and the specific grinding weight of a truth that had no official home. She had carried it until she could put it down in the right place. That was the thing about strength that people misunderstood most consistently, she thought, as the ridge fell away behind her and the valley opened up. It was not the absence of burden. It was the decision, made daily, sometimes hourly, to keep going under the weight of what you were carrying. Not because carrying it was comfortable, not because the ground was level, not because anyone was watching and would understand, but because you were the one who knew what it weighed and what it was and where it needed to go. You kept going because the names deserved to arrive somewhere, because the truth had a destination, even when the road to it was invisible, because the people who are overlooked and dismissed and written out of the record are not erased by that dismissal. They are carrying something the institution does not see, and the carrying goes on regardless of whether the institution is watching. And one day, if you hold on long enough, if you stay functional and present and refuse to agree with the people who decided you did not exist, the door opens and the truth enters the room and it is seen. Maya Reyes ran the last mile with the morning light full on her face and the valley spread wide below, and she ran it like a person who knew exactly who she was and exactly what she was worth, and was no longer asking anyone else's permission to know it. The names had been spoken, the record had been set right, the work ahead was real and hard and hers to do. She ran toward it without slowing down.